It is the night of Vincent's first solo performance, and he is terrified. While he's been a musician for as long as he can remember, he's never performed for anyone other than himself and his instructor. During his final practice on stage, mere hours before performance, his fingers tremble and move away from their intended positions. A harsh note pours from his violin, and suddenly the lights go out all at once. Vincent begins panicking and his fears take over. His practice has stopped, and in his panic he drops the violin. The screen is dark, as Vincent strikes a match, holding it close to see where he's going. He stumbles in the darkness, tripping, and grabbing onto a nearby curtain. Light pours into the building, as Vincent watches the concert hall crumble away, revealing a grim world outside. Following the only path available to him, Vincent makes his way toward a squat, one-story house positioned precariously on a cliff overlooking an endless gray ocean. Inside, he finds an old gentleman playing a violin while staring out at the ocean. The gentleman turns and hands Vincent his violin and points him toward a tall mountain far in the distance, surrounded by fog and darkness. This, he tells Vincent, is where he is needed. Between Vincent and this impossible mountain is a twisted landscape of darkness and deformity. This is the world of Frayeur, and it is up to Vincent to save it. Frayeur is a third-person action-adventure game with RPG and survival horror elements, and themes of fear, vulnerability, and ultimately courage. Frayeur also deals with the hard subject of mental illness, and how anxiety can seep into even the hardest to find cracks. This is not an easy subject to touch on, and we have decided to handle this as delicately as possible, so as not to demonize mental illness. When coming up with this idea, we wanted to help the player empathize with their protagonist. Most everyone can probably relate to the feeling of putting their work in front of others. Is it good enough? Will they like it? By featuring a protagonist that is hampered by this anxiety and whose ultimate goal is to overcome his stage fright and put himself out there no matter the cost, we feel as though the player will more closely relate to him and be more invested in the game as a result. In Frayeur, the player will interact with the world using his violin, which he can play to produce wondrous, near-magical effects. As Vincent is a skilled musician, we wanted to help make the player feel as though they are a musician as well. With this in mind, we designed a game that is built around this idea. The player will interact with the violin like a traditional rhythm game. To play a specific note, the player will hold the left bumper, opening a small menu of environment-altering options, and press the desired face button, giving him access to a subset of abilities available within that menu. This will allow us to more easily control and predict what the player might do in our otherwise open levels, as the player will only have access to a small number of powers at a time. Each of these powers, however, must be learned by Vincent before he can use them to his advantage. Scattered throughout the world are scraps of sheet music. By collecting enough in each of the different areas of the game, the player will unlock new abilities he can use with his violin. One such menu of options deals with manipulating objects via sound, echokinesis. By playing certain notes, which the player can do by pressing and holding a face button without holding the left bumper, the player can lock onto an object and move it in three-dimensional space. By holding another button, he can instead lock that object in place for as long as he plays that note. Another subset of options deals with manipulating the terrain itself. By playing a certain note, the player can conjure walkable terrain. By playing and holding another note, the player can manipulate that terrain. Also available in the world are much longer sections of sheet music. By collecting these longer sheets, the player will have access to multiple button combos. By performing these combos, the player will be able to interact with a larger section of the environment in more powerful ways. These combos work much the same as before, except Vincent now has to play in time with the music. For less powerful combos, Vincent may only be required to play a few notes, but more powerful abilities might require up to 6 button presses. We decided against giving the player traditional weapons in favor of allowing him to interact with his environment in other ways. We also wanted to put the player in the mindset of being afraid, as a reflection of the fear that Vincent is feeling, and this is done by taking away the traditional tools that are used to fight back. As the game progresses, that fear should gradually fade away, as both the player and Vincent get more sure of themselves in this strange world. Other than Vincent's violin, the player will have a host of other minor abilities, with sneaking around and hiding from enemies the most important among them. Along with these mechanics, the player will have access to harmonic resonance, an ability born from Vincent's acute hearing that allows him to sense the presence of enemies around him. In his travels, Vincent will meet a host of strange characters, ranging from the vaguely familiar to the strangely ethereal. Among the most principal of characters is the source of corruption in this world, the Shadow, a being seemingly made of pure smoke, but beneath which is a barely visible humanoid form. With each encounter of the Shadow, the player will engage in a rhythm game battle, as he uses music to defend himself from the Shadow's onslaught. Along Vincent's journey to reach the mountain that is so far away, the Shadow stalks him, waiting for a chance to strike. But the Shadow is not nearly the only entity that Vincent meets. For those characters he would count as friends, Vincent is able to travel with them, finding comfort in new friends in an unfamiliar world. Each of these characters is also able to bring something new to the table that is unique to them. One ally might be able to help Vincent reach higher places by giving him a boost, whereas another might enhance Vincent's performances by playing alongside him. These characters, like the areas they are found in, are taken from periods of Vincent's life where he has felt the most alone and afraid. These characters in turn show that there is nothing to be afraid of. Along with these vaguely familiar characters, throughout the different areas are clues as to what the world of Frayeur actually is. But for as much as we've talked about Vincent and his music, we would be remiss in not talking about our own game's music and atmosphere. Music is an important part of many people's lives, and as such can evoke a great range of emotions in listeners. A fast-tempoed song can evoke feelings of tension, especially when the notes being played are dissonant with each other. They don't sound right, just a little off. And with that tension in music, so often comes release, when the music settles and allows you to breathe. With our game, we want to evoke those same feelings. The tension should build during moments of stress. Perhaps the player has encountered the enemy. In order to facilitate this, we will use a dynamic system, allowing for fast switching of tracks at the right places so that the music can adapt to the situation at hand. The game's atmosphere goes hand in hand with this. We want it to feel tense and stifling, with only a few areas in between to relieve that tension. Our goal is to strike a good balance here. Too much tension without release, and the game becomes too frustrating. The opposite, and there is no challenge. As the game ramps up, we want the player to feel more confident in his abilities. He has conquered every challenge set before him thus far, but as Vincent stares up at the mountain that seemed so far away, he feels the exact opposite from ready. It is here that both Vincent and, hopefully, the player will come to a shocking realization. The world around him, the world through which he's traveled, met new friends in, and made new experiences of, is a construct created by his own inner psyche. The mountain is a representation of his final trial, facing his self-doubt. Even more disturbing is the realization that the shadow that has plagued Vincent's entire journey is actually a reflection of him. Vincent steels himself, and saying goodbye to his allies one last time, he begins the long ascent. In the climactic battle that awaits Vincent at the top of the mountain, he will face the shadow one final time as he uses all of the skills he's learned to defeat his self-doubt and return to the stage where he belongs.